This is the story of a report that predicted human society would collapse, perhaps, within 60 years of its publication. Not from climate change, but from running out of critical, non-renewable resources that have become integral to the way we sustain our population. Grab your broken combs and personal effects, people. It's the limits to growth, and it's a real bummer, because it was written 50 years ago. So, not a lot of time left, huh? Enjoy! Much of the world saw rapid economic growth after the Second World War, and in terms of industrial output and development, both the West, the so-called First World, and the Soviet Union, the Second World, prospered. In the USA, the 1960s were arguably the longest period of rapid and sustained stable growth of any modern nation ever. Economist, Second World War resistance fighter, and industrial manager Aurelio Peccei was tasked with expanding the Fiat car company's operations in South America. He built up a massive subsidiary in Buenos Aires called Fiat Concord, which helped modernize Argentina's agricultural industries and was part of a general government and corporate effort to industrialize the so-called Third World. But by his own account, Peccei began to wonder what the acceleration of growth meant for the developing world, and the world as a whole.
For the first time in human history, there is one mankind, not scattered civilizations in their own environment.
In 1965, he gave a lecture at the Buenos Aires Military Academy. In The Challenge of the 1970s for the World of Today, Peccei broadly explains how, in his mind, technological applications and scientific understanding are accelerating so quickly that those at the forefront of development, namely the United States, are widening a cultural gap between themselves and the rest of the world. He is concerned that technological development is driving a psychological rift not only between the three worlds, but between America and Europe. In the first half of his speech, he also predicts the internet and technology analogous to computer-aided design and 3D printing, and even storing data in remote servers. Although, he also ponders what the average person will do with all the free time techno-industrial development will give them. So there's that. But the real core of Peccei's speech is that the world is more complicated than it ever was, and that it will become exponentially more so, and that unprecedented international cooperation is necessary to prevent, for example, nuclear war, worldwide poverty, or mass hunger. Generally, I'd say his tone is optimistic and even slightly naive in hindsight, but isn't it all? The importance of this lecture, however, was that its transcription was picked up by the then US Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and translated into English, probably in no small part because it talked of the US economy and the growth of its society in glowing terms from a non-American's point of view. Peccei's ideas attracted a lot of attention in Washington and beyond. German Givasciani, vice chairman for the Soviet Science and Technology Committee, wanted to meet Peccei, and he tried to do so through the deputy chairman of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the chemist and scientific advisor Alexander King. Eventually they met and shared ideas, and with logistical help from Givasciani and then US Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Peccei set up a meeting. A meeting to discuss how to devise new ways of conducting human affairs more rationally in this nuclear electronic supersonic age was held by Peccei and King in Rome on the 6th and 7th of April 1968. But they made a mistake in their planning. They invited thinkers, Nobel Prize winners, bankers, philosophers, policymakers, all people with better things to do. And as it turned out, the 6th and 7th of April 1968 was a weekend. King describes the meeting as a complete flop, where participants could not put their differences aside and were generally irritable. The room of distinguished thinkers boiled all the world's problems down into an endless semantic fight between English and French speakers on the meaning of the word systems. Little discussion was actually had. But afterward, Pichai invited 5 of the participants, Alexander King, system scientist Eric Jansch, engineer Hugo Tierman, head of the planning department of France, Jean saint-geours, and Dutch diplomat Max Constam, back to his place for dinner, where the subtext is they all got drunk and had the real meeting. They all agreed that an increasingly interconnected world faces increasingly interconnected problems, and formally established the Club of Rome, a name coined and regretted by King. Their idea was that the Club of Rome, although comprised of bureaucrats and members of political establishments, would be unassociated with governments or corporations, and was little more than an ungoverned network. It was incorporated as a non-profit in Switzerland in 1970, by which time it had at least 25 members. At the end of 1969, King and Pichai became interested in a paper called Toward a General Theory of Planning, written by Hassan Özbekhan, a professor of economic planning at the Systems Development Corporation at UC Santa Monica. He was especially interested in quantifying the world's perceived problems mathematically, and after joining the group, he introduced the idea of a world problematique. Meta-problems that are especially hard to understand in terms of cause and effect, because they're really all different problems with a greater problem. They're all symptoms and causes of each other. In 1970, the group met with J. Forrester, MIT scientist and the founder of systems dynamics, the basis of modern statistics. He had already published a book called Urban Dynamics that sought to apply statistical models to simulate the relationship between a city's infrastructure and its residents, and he was interested in the Club of Rome's ideas and concerns. Forrester set up a group within MIT, funded at least in part by the Volkswagen Foundation through academic connections. It was headed by Forrester's department assistant Dennis Meadows and his wife Donella. They took the systems dynamics program that Forrester had built, World 2, and used it as a starting point to make a brand new model called World 3. Using 5 variables: population, food production, industrial output, pollution, and finite resources, World 3 simulated the interaction between these variables over the next 100 years or so. The findings were circulated at first in the academic world, then published in 1972 as a book, based on the paper of the same name. The book wasn't actually written by King or Pichai, but rather Dennis and Donella Meadows. The Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth explains the ramifications of exponential growth, and makes the case that although productivity per capita is increasing, the current data shows that industrialized nations are growing exponentially, whereas unindustrialized ones are growing linearly. Potentially, the book suggests, this could see the development of 2 separate worlds, more alien to each other than East and West. But its most pressing point is that if exponential growth continues beyond 1972, if the human race continues its business-as-usual model of population, the Earth will run out of the non-renewable resources it needs to support such a population within less than 100 years. Around which time all of those lovely lines will start going down. This is what the book is about. Our planet has finite resources. Exponential growth will inevitably exceed carrying capacity. If we don't plan for this, It'll be a disaster. And by disaster, I mean the economy not existing will be like the least of our problems. It'll be famine. That's what the book says. According to the model, industrial output and agricultural output decline quickly over 20 years, with population continuing to grow until it sharply declines too. In the standard World 3 run, which has been replicated many times since, 2075's population is the same as the population in around 1975. In this scenario, the authors explain, the industrial capital stock grows to a level that requires an enormous input of resources. In the very process of that growth, it depletes a large fraction of the resource reserves available. As resource prices rise and mines are depleted, more and more capital must be used for obtaining resources, leaving less to be invested for future growth. Finally, investment cannot keep up with depreciation, and the industrial base collapses, taking with it the service and agricultural systems, which have become dependent on industrial inputs, such as fertilizers, pesticides, hospital laboratories, computers, and especially energy for mechanization. The limits to growth also explains that arable land use has grown exponentially too, and that technological developments, increases in productivity, only briefly delay the intersection between supply and demand. It points out too that if half of all arable land is used today, and by today I mean 1972, then that half is naturally the more desirable half. The remaining half is more difficult to cultivate, will require more input to extract output, and will ultimately be less efficient to cultivate. 1 billion hectares of arable land were needed to feed the world in 1950, and with exponential growth, that's 2 billion hectares in 1980 and 4 billion in 2010, and then more hectares are needed than exist by 2040. In part 2, I'll go into this far more, but at this point I will say that the figures presented concerning cultivatable land were greatly overestimated. With exponential growth, reserves of non-renewable resources diminish rapidly. One of the examples they use is chromium, which would last for another 420 years at the 1972 rate of consumption. But with exponential growth, the mineable chromium would be depleted in 95 years, or perhaps 125 years when, after 90 years and with only 5 years of supply left, everyone starts complaining about the price of chromium. As the book says, even if supply was doubled, that would only stave off supply collapse for about 20 years, because to an extent, demand meets supply. The book talks about pollution, which at the time was very difficult to measure. It notes that observable pollution is growing exponentially. It talks about the compounding problems of global warming, CO2, and it uses Lake Ontario as an example of an ecosystem crashing under the weight of pollution. The book also gives modern whaling as an example of an industry that has peaked and grown itself into extinction, where no amount of technological progress can fix it.
Yes, I think that many people have found a new way of making fools of themselves in not recognizing that there are limits to human expansion.
So the book makes clear it's not an issue so much of running out of farmland, but running out of things like precious metals or petroleum that are necessary to maintain industrial agriculture. And don't even get me started on nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer. It's the only thing I can think about. It's direct, and it acknowledges the study's limits and boundaries. A computer model that seeks to simulate the most important variables of the world will always be necessarily incomplete. The final parts of the limits to growth discuss different scenarios, such as people not bothering about this until the year 2000, the fools. It offers not so much solutions, but ideas for solutions, although it admits meaningful action to prevent collapse will take unprecedented international action. All of its ideas, in fact, call for this. Of course they do. It's the solution. I think it's important to stress that World 3 and the limits to growth don't predict industrial collapse based on totally running out of one particular non-renewable resource, but getting to the point where it is economically more expensive to extract that resource than the resource is worth, and then getting to the point where this is the case for multiple resources, where they can't easily be replaced with something more abundant. I think a fallacy that's easy to fall into when it comes to topics like this is thinking, well, the Earth has it, so we can get it. An example given is this. You can find bits of chromium or other precious metals in chunks of granite, but is it worth it to dynamite a 2,000-pound chunk of granite, drill it, and wash it with chemicals for 1 pound of chromium? Is that scalable? If it is, how long will that last? Anyway, you get the point, and as it happens, don't have nightmares about chromium. It turns out we've got chromium aplenty. When The Limits of Growth was published, it was met with varied reactions, and a substantial amount of criticism. Some decried it as capitalist propaganda, designed to undermine the idea of a proletariat utopia, and we were so close. Others saw it as anti-business and regressive. Many critics, especially economists, pointed to Malthus. In 1798, clergyman and economist Thomas Malthus anonymously published an essay on the principle of population. It argues that the growth of population outpaces food production, and that eventually this capacity will be surpassed, leading to eventual famine. Critically, Malthus argued that increasing agricultural capacity encourages population growth. So, if more land is farmed more efficiently, that will only create a surplus for so long before that surplus is met, or eaten into, by a greater population. Malthus also argued that increasing populations inevitably kept the price of labour down. Many of his contemporary critics decried Malthus's essay as pessimistic, and an error for analysing human behaviour as if it's no different from animals. Marx hated Malthus, and thought his arguments were idealistic in the worst way, and bourgeois. Always with the bourgeois, Carl, look in the mirror. Engels believed Malthus failed to recognise human ingenuity, and that in capitalistic societies, scientific and technological progress is as unlimited and at least as rapid as that of population. This sentiment was echoed over the years by other political economists world over. By the 20th century, Malthus was largely thought to have been disproven. The Industrial Revolution made Malthus's projections obsolete, and technology saved the world from growing itself to death forever. Technological progress and human ingenuity are also central points of criticism to The Limits to Growth. I think this criticism was probably especially compelling in the 70s. Humankind had just been to the moon, the world was vastly different technologically and socially a mere generation ago. Even if the grim projections of the boffins is right, who knows what's around the corner, with computing and automation potentially catapulting the human race into a future where these concerns are trivial. Perhaps anticipating the accusations of pessimism, the book repeats that this is all avoidable if action is taken. If anything, it makes its case optimistically, although I can imagine it was devastating for many who read it. It sort of manages to be the antithesis of modern ideology's core, the one thing that the world seemed to agree on: growth. Surely inescapably, the Limits to Growth book is very broad. At the same time, it's quite concise. It's one of the few academic papers or books I've read where I was left thinking it would have benefited from being a little bit longer. Although it was widely read in the 70s, and although it has been highly influential in relative academic circles since then, It did not provoke the positive change that it essentially begs for. Indeed, I'm not sure it influenced much beyond thought. That's because its greatest downfall is inescapable too. What, so we all stop making money? We all stop building bridges and eating burgers, and the rest of the world does that too as well, do they? Because we might run out of something in 60 years. In 60 years, we'll all be dead, and someone will have probably come up with something anyway. Join me in part 2, where I'll explain, with graphs, that someone didn't. See you then. Don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting videos like this one, and bang that bell, clang that bell, harangue that bell. Oh. Bye.